Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The topic of this presentation is going to be about the epistemological developments in ESP research. The main objective of this presentation is to lay out the prominent periodic phases that mark out the development in ESP research and the peculiarity of each phase in the field. Of course, the discussion of these phases is very important inasmuch as the theoretical niceties of each phase translate directly to distinct pedagogical practices as a result of the implicational capacities in ESP research. The second objective of this presentation, other than providing a historical overview, is to sketch a context for explaining the main teaching decisions that are made at the level of syllable design, instruction and assessment. ESP, as the name suggests, can be defined in terms of being specific, that is, being clearly defined, and being purpose-driven, that is, being laid out with predetermined learning outcomes. The specificity of learning objectives and purposes in ESP implies that learners' needs are very important to validate the teaching practices which have the goal of enabling learners to use language in a specific context or target situation. Language use here has to be authentic and genuine. In view of that, ESP has 5 main pillars: purpose, specificity, learners' needs, target situation, and authenticity. Given the clearly defined learning objectives, many scholars make the claim that ESP can be equated with any teaching experience that is well structured. In other words, all good teaching is ESP in the loose sense of the word. However, in the strict sense, it should be noted that ESP is generally associated with adults who have professional and/or academic needs in a formal EFL environment. Another way of identifying what ESP really is to contrast it to other close yet distinct approaches to English language teaching. In view of that, Atkinson and Waters in their seminal work in 1987 contrast ESP to English for general purposes, that is EGP, English for academic and occupational purposes, EAOP, English for academic purposes, EAP, English for occupational purposes, EOP, and English for science and technology, EST. The historical development of ESP can be divided into 4 main phases. Of course, this division is motivated by explanatory purposes, and it does not accurately depict the actual course of the theoretical advancements. In fact, the development is continuous rather than categorical. After the end of World War II, English emerged as the world's most dominant language. The economic growth and the technological development catapulted English into being the world's lingua franca. Many people felt the need to learn English, not for the pleasure of it, but rather for their desire to improve their status. Countries started to send students to learn abroad, which necessitated that they learn English for the specific purposes of their professional and academic careers. The increase in need to learn English for specified target situations, coupled with the noticeable changes in the theories of humanities and social sciences, was the starting point of what was later referred to as ESP, both as a pedagogical practice and a field of inquiry. The second phase in the development of ESP occurred in the 1960s. In this phase, the first practices in ESP can be assumed to be present in register analysis, where technical writing was subject to systematic analysis so as to underpin the lexical niceties of such register. The teacher's task here is to enable the learners to acquire the lexical items associated with a given domain. The early practices of register analysis seem to have overlooked the structural aspects of scientific texts, as its interest was purely lexical. However, later practices such as rhetorical and discourse analysis aim to address questions of why and how certain linguistic units are combined to serve certain functions, thus adding a functional aspect to the formal analysis of language. Therefore, the selection of teaching materials in ESP started to take into account language use as the main criterion. This meant that more attention is paid to the communicative content of discourse rather than the lexicosyntactic properties of texts. The third phase in the development of ESP can be traced to the 1980s, where substantial changes took place. The first noticeable change is observed in the shift from focusing on teaching how language works to emphasizing skills that learners are expected to transfer in the specific target situations for which learning initially took place. This skill-based approach took into account learners' specific needs, which was previously underscored by the remarkable focus on text properties. This shift translated directly to noticeable changes in the kind of scholarly publications, which started to be leaning more into the analysis of learners. An example of this can be found in the seminal publication of Mumbai's Model of Needs Analysis. The purpose of ESP at this phase was to enable learners to develop not only linguistic competence, but also other underlying competencies that enable them to eventually become independent learners. Hutchinson and Waters' work in 1987 outlined the main features of learner-centered approach, which was believed to be predicated upon the exploitation of learners' already possessed skills, taking into account learners' different learning styles. The remarkable progress in ESP in this phase was accompanied with a disagreement among scholars regarding the teaching objectives. Some scholars advocated the wide-angle approach, which revolves around achieving the learning objectives through teaching English through materials that are not necessarily limited to the learning specialties. Other researchers, however, preached the narrow approach, which emphasizes the exclusion of materials that are not directly related to the learner's predetermined and specific purposes of learning English. Another controversy seems to revolve around whether teaching English for specific purposes should take into account developing all linguistic skills, such as reading and writing, or it should focus only on skills that are directly addressing the learning specific purposes. Despite the remarkable progress in this phase, the emphasis seems to have drifted away from developing teaching materials to a tendency to focus on drawing the broad guidelines for the teaching approaches. The final phase in the historical development of ESP started around the turn of the century. From the late 1990s onward, the changes in ESP are best captured in the article of Howings in 2002. Howings is a co-editor in the Scientific Journal of English for Specific Purposes. He analyzed the articles published over the course of 20 years, and he mentions that the development can be summarized in 4 major points. First, there is a remarkable increase in scholarly publications outside the US and the United Kingdom. Second, ESP started to be accepted more as a discipline of research than an approach to teaching English. Third, the focus of ESP started to be oriented towards EOP, where the primary focus is to prepare learners for their prospective occupations. Finally, it is noticed that ESP started to entertain a more interdisciplinary position, as ESP papers started to appear in journals that have other research scopes.